All right, so it is 5:30. It is the work session meeting for the City of Minnetrista, City Council meeting, September 21st. We only have one item on our agenda, and that is internet discussion. This evening, joining us is Bob Vos with Kennedy and Graven. I'm first going to hand it over to Mike real quick for a few quick comments, and then I think he's going to be handing it over to Bob. All right,
Yes.
Mike?
Yes, thank you, Mayor and Council. So tonight, as the Mayor described, we have Bob Vos, who works for Kennedy and Graven as an attorney. His background and expertise, I guess, is in the area of communications and telecommunications, probably amongst other things. And so what we did for the packet tonight, and what I hope to have Bob talk about with you, is a few things. One, we did include the contract, so I'd like to discuss that a little bit. The other thing is, I think for kind of perspective and just to kind of get an understanding of why we have what we have for telecommunications here in Minnetrista. We're not alone. It's an issue that's ongoing in many communities across the country. It's been exacerbated by the fact that a lot of people are working from home now. Kids are going to school from home, so it's kind of become a little bit more of a front burner issue versus a back burner issue. And then, and as I said, that kind of goes hand in hand with the complaints that we have been getting. We've been getting them all along, but again, that's just part of the fact that we're out here in kind of the edge of the metro area for one reason. But so with that kind of as a quick overview, I'd like to ask Bob if you wouldn't mind talking to us a little bit about kind of things I started with. I don't know if you want to start with the kind of historical, how we got to where we are right now, Bob, or if that's a good place to start or what. I'll just let you take it.
Sounds great, Mike. Thank you. Again, Bob Vos, Kennedy and Graven. Mayor, just to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can.
Perfect, great. Yeah, so the very, very short curriculum vitae that Mike gave is right. So I'm Ron's colleague at Kennedy and Graven. In addition to serving as city attorney for now, I think 7 or 8 cities, if you can believe it, I am kind of our telecom guy. And what telecom guy means at our law firm, representing essentially only local governments, what that means is I handle wireless leasing issues, use of water towers for wireless leases and other city facilities. I'm our cable television franchising guy, handle cable television franchising matters for a number of cities and some cable commissions, including not inconsequentially the Lake Minnetonka Cable Commission that Minnetrista was a member of back a little less than a decade ago. And then I also handle, to the extent local governments, and this is a relatively rare thing in Minnesota, but to the extent cities and other local governments are building their own networks, and again, not a common thing, but it certainly has happened. That's kind of in my bailiwick too. So that's the backstory on me. The backstory, Mike, you kind of wanted to kick it off with an overview of telecom law, and we could literally spend hours and hours and hours talking about that. We're not going to do that. The really high level overview of telecom law is that I think that the easiest way to summarize it is that it is in many respects antiquated. It's antiquated in the United States for this reason. Both at the federal level and at the state level, at least in the state of Minnesota, we divide up telecom laws into sort of 3 separate silos, 3 separate columns, if you will. And those are telephone regulations, telephone laws, internet laws, laws that deal with the relatively, in the world of telecom, new technology. It's not new to all of us, but it's relatively speaking new to internet, and then cable television. So the laws in the country are divided up into those silos, into those columns, and there are totally different sets of rules for those 3 columns. And yet the fact is the telecom industry has converged. In fact, it converged quite a while ago, probably more than 10 years ago, going on 20 years ago. The providers of telephone service internet service and cable service, which were once separate businesses, separate companies in those lines of business, of course, have all converged. And now phone companies provide internet services and cable services. Traditional cable companies like Mediacom, or in the inner ring metro area Comcast, provide internet and phone services. And there really aren't any, or not many, companies anymore that are just internet companies. There are certainly fiber companies, companies that install infrastructure and make available that infrastructure for services including internet, but there aren't really sort of just internet service providers as much as there once was. So the reality is that the businesses, those lines of businesses, have all converged together, and all of the companies, or many of the companies, provide two, or in some cases all three of those services. And yet our laws, our regulations in this country continue to sort of view those as totally separate things and regulate them as separate things. That's important to us at the city level as city officials because, and again, I am summarizing greatly here, that's important to us because really we at the local level have virtually no authority over telephone service. Telephone service is regulated by the FCC to some extent, and then to a larger extent by the Minnesota State Public Utilities Commission. And cities have very little authority over telephone services other than when telephone companies use our right-of-way. We have right-of-way permits that we issue for telephone systems, but beyond that, we have little authority over telephone service. We have really almost no authority over internet service standing alone. That service has been ruled at the federal level to be essentially beyond the reach of any regulatory body. Internet service is essentially unregulated at any level. And that leaves cable service, and cable service historically has been the most city-focused, local government-focused kind of telecom service provided. Historically, cities were really alone in regulating and dealing with cable service when it was a new service back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. That became regulated at the federal level. Cities remained, though, the primary contact point between cable service and consumers and government. That remains true today, although the degree of regulatory authority that local governments have over cable has also diminished to some degree. So cable really is where cities have the most say, as it were, over telecom services, although our authority in that area too has become somewhat more limited. So that's a really 30,000 foot overview on the way telecom services in this country are regulated and the way they're regulated in Minnesota and in your community. So then let me just turn quickly, and then I'll ask for direction from Mike or from council members about where you want to go. But let me talk for a few minutes about the background on your cable television service, your contract. It's called a franchise. Your franchise contract with your provider in Minnetrista, Mediacom. The backstory on that goes back to, I mentioned that I'm the legal counsel to the Lake Minnetonka Cable Commission. The Lake Minnetonka Cable Commission, a couple of decades ago, issued a franchise on behalf of, I want to say it was 17 cities. I could be wrong about that number, but a lot of cities around the Lake Minnetonka area, including Minnetrista. And that was the arrangement that the Cable Commission regulated cable TV service by Mediacom's predecessor. It wasn't a company, it was Triax, and before that it was a different company. But that was all handled, the franchising of cable service was all handled by the Cable Commission. Back, I'll call it a decade ago, it was a little less than that, a number of the Lake Minnetonka Cable Commission cities, including Minnetrista, became concerned about, and now I'm sort of speaking on behalf of not the Cable Commission, my client, but on behalf of cities like Minnetrista, I think became concerned primarily about the lack of build out, the lack of complete service by Mediacom or its predecessor in some of the member city communities, including again Minnetrista. Other examples were Orono and Medina, and there were several others that were concerned about not having complete coverage, not having complete service availability throughout their cities. And a concern about that sort of grew among those cities, and some of the cities, including Minnetrista, elected to, as was your right, withdraw from the Cable Commission and seek to renegotiate the franchise with Mediacom on a city level rather than on a group level through the Cable Commission. You and some other cities elected to negotiate your own franchise with Mediacom. So Mike has helpfully passed out the franchise contract that you have. I will say that contract, your franchise, is quite similar to the franchises that some of the other cities that withdrew from the Cable Commission negotiated. Again, Medina and Orono being examples of that. Your franchises ended up being fairly similar. I think probably in part that was because I, of course, didn't represent you in those negotiations. I was still representing the Cable Commission. And so you used a different legal counsel, and that legal counsel worked for those other cities, and I think negotiated very similar deals for several communities, including Minnetrista. With respect to this issue that I think is your focal point here tonight, that the issue of pushing Mediacom to provide service more thoroughly throughout your community. And let me just say as an aside, as a caveat, I'm talking about a cable television franchise that regulates cable television service, and that really is the extent of your direct authority. But you knew then, and I think I would encourage you to remember now, that the reason you cared about pushing Mediacom to expand its coverage in your community is because you knew then and you know now that Mediacom provides internet services and where they can phone services over that same network. So to the extent you press them to expand their cable service territory, you are also pressing them indirectly to expand their internet service availability. So with that in mind, you negotiated back in about 2013. I think extending the franchise, I think, finally became effective toward the beginning of 2014. You addressed that squarely, the issue of what areas Mediacom needed to expand to. And in your franchise, in your contract with Mediacom, you required in 2014 an expansion of service that hadn't previously been available into the what's called the Kings Point development. I take it you would all know where that is and what that is. I don't, but I take it you know what that is. That the franchise contract indicated would require about 4 to 6 miles of new plant construction by Mediacom. You then, under your contract, required some additional expansion in the period from 2015 to 2017. That the franchise indicates was going to involve up to 20 plus miles of additional plant being constructed by Mediacom. And then your contract contemplates a third phase of expansion. That would be the phase we're in now, but helpfully or not, the contract does not specify a time period over which that third phase of expansion needs to occur. There is no deadline, I guess I'm saying, for that third phase of expansion to occur. But the franchise does contemplate that there's going to be a third phase of expansion to folks that don't already have service. And the franchise talks about the city and the company having some level of communication about that. And some, I guess, the city could push for reporting by the company about whether expansion is occurring, and if so, how. Last thing to say then about the Mediacom contract, and I should just say in the way of sort of confession and avoidance, I've spent time looking at the contract when Mike helpfully passed it out to all of us, but I'm certainly not an expert on every, I haven't studied it with a great deal of a close review, but I've looked over all of the provisions. And so I guess I would just add that the term, the period that contract is effective was intended to be a 10-year term running from the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. So in other words, expiring in or around 2024. But the contract also says that the company would be entitled to a 5-year automatic extension of that term if they were substantially compliant with the contract with the franchise. I'm not sure whether they have been compliant or not. That's not something I've been asked to study. But that is what the franchise says. It says it runs through about 2024 with a right to an additional 5 years if the company is in substantial compliance. that is interesting. And now try not to have your eyes glaze over, because this is cable television law geeky stuff that I'm going to talk about. But that is interesting, that arrangement, 10 years plus a potential 5-year extension automatically. That's interesting because cable franchises, as a function of federal law, the cable operator must ask to renew its franchise about 3 years prior to expiration. So around 2021, Mediacom would normally be obligated to ask for a renewal of its contract, and at that point, a process would begin, a process for review of their compliance and of what the community needs going forward, one of which presumably would be further build out. That is normally to begin in 2021. The franchise, though, that you have says the company, if it wants to ask for that 5-year extension, needs to ask for it 1 year prior to expiration. That is to say, in or about 2023. So I'm not clear. I'm not, just because I didn't negotiate it and I'm not familiar with it, I'm not clear how that was meant to work. Was Mediacom expected to ask for a renewal in 2021 and you to start doing the work required to deal with the renewal in 2021, or did everyone expect to not do anything until a year prior to expiration, that is, do nothing until 2023? I don't know the answer to that question. That's something that might require a little deeper dive, but that is certainly an interesting twist. And I say it's an interesting twist because of what I already have alluded to, and that is that in the normal course, if the company was just going to ask for a renewal and ask for it in 2021, the city at that point would begin to do some work. You would do some work on evaluating whether the company was in compliance, whether they had performed or not, and you would do some work on figuring out what's most important to you to see in a renewed contract. And then, and I will stop Mayor and Mike after the last comment here, whether the company is in compliance and has complied with its contract, I guess, is what their extension right turns on. And that is exactly one of the things that you would be evaluating if you started doing your work in 2021, expecting a renewal of the contract, if the contract is only going to be for 10 years. So I guess what I'm saying is maybe either way, whether the contract is only for 10 years through 2024 because there's a concern about compliance, or whether there's an argument that the contract extends another 5 years, either way, it might behoove the city to be taking a look at around 2021 or even this year, whether the company has been complying with the contract and whether there are issues that have gone unaddressed that should have been addressed. And I guess I lied, Mayor and Mike, I'm sorry, one last comment, truly last comment, and that is that I'm sure there are some number of folks in your community that are not happy with the level of service they're able to get without using Mediacom. People that can't get Mediacom's service, who are not very happy with the level of internet service that they can get through Frontier or whoever else makes that service available. I'm sure that's the case. That's the case anywhere else your situation is. That is that the cable operator hasn't served everybody. Folks are often concerned about the level of internet they can get. I'm sure there are some people that would say, let's not have Mediacom anymore. Let's contract with somebody else. And I would say that's not impossible as a theoretical matter, but it's only a theoretical matter. Federal law essentially grants cable companies the right to keep doing business, the right to get their franchise renewed, unless through a litigation-like process, a city can prove that the operator has failed to perform at a pretty material level, and the operator is not going to be able to perform in the future. And again, to get to that point where you could actually not renew with Mediacom and bring in a different provider would require a litigation type or actual litigation to get to that stage. So it's a theoretical possibility to not renew a contract with Mediacom and bring in a different operator, but it's extremely difficult given the federal law cards that we at the city level have been dealt. And then I truly will stop at that point.
So Mr. Voss, so are you saying that the city could not invite other cable companies to come in alongside outside of Mediacom. In other words, we keep Mediacom, but we invite another cable provider or two or whatever to come in and also provide a service. Is that not an option?
Yeah, Mayor Whalen and council members, absolutely fantastic clarification. That is not at all what I'm saying. You're exactly right. Your question suggests that you know the answer, and that you're exactly right about that. The franchise you have issued to Mediacom is, as a matter of the contract itself and as a matter of state law and federal law, non-exclusive. So although competition, direct competition between cable providers historically was non-existent. Cable companies would never invade each other's territory. That was simply because of the facts of the market. There was never a prohibition against that happening, and that does happen now. Mayor, to your point, that does happen. There is cable competition in places around the country, and there are quite a few places, frankly, in Minnesota, where companies are competing in the cable television service arena. Frankly, Frontier is your incumbent phone company, as I understand it. And Frontier actually about 7-8 years ago, around the time of your renewal, actually a little bit less time ago than that, maybe 5 years ago, Frontier went out and began getting cable franchises and attempting to compete in video services. That experiment failed. I think it's fair to say Frontier is not continuing to get franchises and is giving them up, is not continuing to provide video competition, never did, as I understand it, in Minnetrista. But that experiment for Frontier failed, but it was possible. Had they asked you for a franchise, you could have issued one to them and they could have competed in cable television with Mediacom and with anybody else who would like to enter the market in your community.
So,
Thank you.
Bob, before we get somebody else to jump in, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of questions. One of the things that came up when Cassandra Tabor was our director of administration is that I believe the company was called Jaguar, and I think when we talked, they've been bought out last year. I don't know by who, you could probably remind us, but nonetheless, this was a company that's like west of here that was interested in trying to move into our area and provide services, the competition that you spoke about. But I think sometime last year they got bought out. I don't have any idea where they're at now, whoever owns it. Can you shed a little light on that group? Because I think that's a good example of a competition point for Mediacom.
Yeah, Mike, it's a good point. And yes, so Jaguar was based out of Owatonna and provided service in Owatonna, and then they have, you're right, expanded and brought competition, video, and other forms, phone and internet competition to another number of communities, including I think quite a chunk of Carver County and Scott County. So you're quite right to think about them. They were bought out, as I understand it. Now, let me preface everything now I'm about to say about Jaguar with it's my understanding that. Please don't think that I'm an expert on Jaguar's business. I'm not, but I do have an understanding, I think, about what this is what I've heard, I understand to be the case. Jaguar was bought out, in effect, or actually bought out by a company called Metronet, not a company based out of Minnesota. That buyout, as is commonly the case, infused some new capital or some new capital opportunities for Jaguar. And they have reached out to a number of communities where they want to expand, several communities that I work with. So, I have sort of boots on the ground experience with them reaching out to communities and indicating they want to expand service into those communities with the infusion of capital that they've had through this buyout. And those services would include, of course, triple play services, meaning cable services, video services. And so they will be seeking franchises, cable contracts in those communities. Are they ripe for you to communicate with? I just don't know enough about Jaguar's plans to tell you that, but they certainly would be an appropriate party to contact if you wanted to contact somebody about possibly expanding services into your community.
Very good, thank you. Council?
Right. Council. We'll start with anybody?
This is Shannon Bruce. if I may. This contract with Mediacom really doesn't deal with broadband, 5G, or any internet services, and I'm a little confused as to why we're even examining the Mediacom contract, because it seems to only deal with cable television, and yes, they are carrying internet traffic and data, but their contract doesn't even speak to that. And I'd like to have a discussion about broadband 5G and how we can, and maybe that's a different meeting. But I don't see Mediacom being involved in that at all, because they're a cable provider. They lay cable, and broadband 5G is wireless. So those are two different worlds, and I think we're just talking about cable tonight, and I don't see that as even being relevant to deploying broadband high-speed internet throughout Minnetrista, because I don't think we're going to do that with cable.
So if I may, Councilmember Bruce, you're right. So in your question, you were talking about broadband and 5G, and you indicated with your question that you understand that 5G refers to wireless service. That's right, it does. 5G is the 5th generation of advancement in wireless services, and it does allow higher speed, more broadband service to be provided wirelessly. Excuse me. So you're quite right about that. And I guess I would just add to my sort of silo discussion. I talked about telephone service, internet service, and cable service as being the primary regulatory silos that we think about. Really, wireless is almost a 4th silo. It really is, again, regulated in a somewhat different way. The bottom line, though, is it's fantastic to talk about it, and it's important to talk about it, because there is a big element of the rollout of 5G by the big, now only 3 players in wireless. We're down to 3 companies through mergers and acquisitions, and those are the companies rolling out 5G primarily across the country. And it's right to talk about that, but there's no regulatory authority for cities to sort of press for that service, or frankly even to prevent that service. We don't have either card to play to push for it or prevent it. What we do have is we have authority over how it's deployed in our communities. Deploying 5G requires, unlike traditional 4G or earlier generations of wireless service that relied on big antenna arrays that were often on things like city water towers and were located 2, 3, 4 miles apart from one another. That's not the way 5G is deployed. It's deployed in smaller, lower to the ground, much closer together deployments that go on to things like utility poles or other structures that are about the same size as utility poles and are spaced about the same distance apart as utility poles. So that's the way 5G is deployed, and cities have a role in regulating and making sure that that's deployed in the right of way on poles in a way that's safe and to some extent aesthetically acceptable. And that's a new thing. The FCC has just adopted rules on that, and those rules are being, as they always are, litigated. So that litigation is going on now about what the rules say and what role cities have in regulating how that stuff is deployed. But there really isn't a lever for cities to push on to either cause the deployment of 5G or to prevent the deployment of 5G. And you know, why would any city ever want to prevent the deployment? I don't know that there are any that would want to, but there is a concern about how dense those wireless facilities are going to have to be in communities and what aesthetic impact there's going to be. So there isn't really much for cities to push on about that other than to deal with the deployment vis-a-vis your right-of-way and how those poles and antennas get put up.
And at the end of the day, from reading the Mediacom contract, I think I remember seeing that they require 15 houses per mile for density for them to be required to supply cable, and that as long as we don't have the density that to comply with that requirement, then I don't see that there's much of an option in dealing with Mediacom here. And am I missing something?
No, Councilmember Bruce, it's an excellent point. But I would make this clarification to the good point, and that is that what I described about what your contract says about build out, I described that initially your cable contract required a build out in 2014 to Kings Point, and that was about 4 to 6 miles. And then in 2015 to 2017, an additional 20 miles of cable were required to be laid. And then there's a third phase that doesn't have a deadline on it, but it's spelled out with some specificity in your contract. It's at the end of the contract. You'll see that phase 3 map that actually shows an area that should be built out eventually. All of that is required regardless of the density of homes in those areas. So the density of home requirement that you're talking about, the 15 homes per mile, that is an alternative obligation on Mediacom. Let me explain that. Okay. So in other words, they had to build out to Kings Point regardless of density. They had to build out to the additional 20 miles shown on the phase 1 and phase 2 maps at the end of your franchise. And although there's no deadline, they need to build out or begin building out to the third phase. All of that is in addition to over and above their obligation to build out anywhere in your community where there is a density of 15 homes per mile. So you really have two levers to deal with Mediacom on. One is the maps at the back of your franchise, the 3 phases shown at the back of the franchise, and then also the density obligation that you've referred to.
Would it be possible to get better maps? Because I looked at those maps and it was impossible to tell where they're just so tiny you can't even read them.
Well, yeah, yeah, we need better maps. That was what I said this afternoon to staff. Yep.
Okay, so just for clarification, when Cassandra was here, she did work with Bob Bose, and Bob was able to provide Cassandra with some talking points, essentially on how to ask Mediacom to provide better maps than those, I don't know what they look like, Rorschach tests. You know, they're just black dots on a big map of Minnetrista that's pretty tiny. So I think we do have in possession some of the maps. Don't know exactly how up to date they are. They're at least a year old, potentially 2 years old, depending on whatever it is they had finished and when that got put on a map. But we do have some better maps than the ones that are in the contract. But nonetheless, you know, we still would have, I think, a hard time pressing them on the 15, the additional 15 units per mile, because they don't measure 15 units per mile like we measure 15 units per mile. I'm not trying to be tricky here, but they go from like a node, some point of intersection where the wire ends, and that from that point to the next point is the mile. It's not as the crow flies or radius, it's some other way of measuring it, because we've had neighborhood just down the road from City Hall here ask, and it's been gobbledygook to try to get them to do anything, because they're able to show us, not sure convinced if they are, but they're able to show us that it's not quite 15 per mile, so therefore they're not going to build it out, even though it says that they're supposed to. Some of the residents
Well,
there say, well,
I think one of the things we need to find out is phase 1, we understand that's Kings Point Road, Woodland Cove, but what about phase 2? I'm unclear as to exactly where that is, and has that actually been built out? I mean, those would be the questions.
Whalen,
yes.
this is Allie. When I first started, I asked for updated maps, and I did receive some, so I can send those out. They're a lot better than what's in your packet. They're color coded, so I can either send those out tonight or tomorrow or sometime this week, so you guys can get a better idea. But I do have updated maps.
That would be helpful. All right. Yes, Bruce?
But Mary, you're right. We don't know if they've complied with the 20 miles that were supposed to be done between 2015 and 2017, and if they've decided to begin on phase 3, even though there's no deadline, what they're doing there. So.
Okay. The other thing is, I agree, you know, we need to have broadband, we need to have 5G, but for those people that have almost nothing, I mean, very little, they're dealing with Frontier, I think the cable would be maybe a slight improvement or upgrade. I don't know. Both are bad, but it might be slightly better than what they currently have. So just a comment there.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, if I can just say, of course, Frontier has had difficulties both in terms of regulatory issues with our state Public Utilities Commission and other states. They've had some difficulties in customer service performance. They've also now got financial issues in that they've declared bankruptcy and are working out their financial arrangements. So, those are the facts. And I've heard anecdotally that their internet service, where they provide it, is not perfect. Let's put it that way. So I can kind of confirm, from an anecdotal perspective, what you're hearing in your community is not, you're not alone in that hearing that about Frontier. And it's been my experience that what you're saying is exactly right. Even if you've got less than perfect providers of services competing, Mediacom and Frontier, let's say, for example, the fact of people having a choice and having the ability to switch, et cetera, does give the consumer some ability to control what's going on, or give the feeling of some control over that issue. And I think you'd find, you're right, that Mediacom's service is somewhat more robust than Frontier's service, although again, probably imperfect.
Thank you. Council, other questions or comments?
Well, this is Pam, and one of my questions is, so we don't even know what the third phase is composed of?
Where it is
yeah,
would be the question.
What the plans are for third phase?
I'm not an expert in this area by far, but I think you're correct. I would not have any way to tell you tonight, council member, what the third phase is entails.
And if I may add, Mayor, Mike, and council member, I think that's right. I mean, the way I understand the franchise to be drafted, it contemplates an effort by Mediacom, some attempt by Mediacom to construct in this phase 3 area to the extent anyone can understand what it is. And maybe we've got some additional maps that make that a little bit clearer. Maybe we don't, I'm not sure. But if we can identify what that phase 3 was meant to include, I'd have to read the franchise to be saying they're supposed to be making an effort to expand in that area. And I guess that would likely go to, at the end of the day, the question of whether there's been substantial compliance. That is, whether they're entitled to an automatic 5 additional years, or whether their franchise is expiring at the end of 10 years and thus they must renegotiate. If they've made no effort whatsoever to build out in phase 3 at the end of this time, I don't want to get ahead of my skis here too much, but it wouldn't surprise me to hear a city say in that environment, you've not substantially complied, you've made no effort, and so we're not going to recognize a right to an additional 5 years. You need to renegotiate with us now. So that's a very, I realize, indirect way to get at enforcement or get at what is the obligation, but that I'm kind of conjuring that was what is intended by the franchise as it's written.
This is Shannon Bruce. So perhaps the direction to staff is to communicate with Mediacom and report back to council what effort they are making, if they are making any effort, to reach phase 3, and to let us know what the result of your conversation is with them.
Mayor and council, so I'm going to agree with council member Bruce, but I would like to actually expand that, because the Kings Point, which is the Woodland Cove area, that was a 2014 issue. And I do know that there are people that live there that are still kind of disappointed with their service that's being provided by Mediacom. And I think it's because, I don't know all the technical details, but when they installed all their stuff, it's like, if you think about having a computer from 2014 and what you would buy if you bought a computer today, I mean, in the telecommunication industry, I think it changes that way as well. So the capacity that they have. And so I think what they've been working on when they do go back and work in the Woodland Cove area, if there's new houses being sold, they're trying to upgrade equipment. So I'm not exactly sure where they are on wanting to upgrade equipment there based on the growth of the Woodland Cove area. And then to go to the 20 miles, wherever those are, that was supposed to be done between 15 and 17. I have no idea how far along they got in those. And then in addition, we could identify the third phase, even though there's no time frame, but like to know what has been done that's been addressed through the third phase of their build out. So I think it might be worth a review of all the three phases versus just the last phase.
I think definitely we're going to need a review of all three phases, no doubt. The other question I would have is, why wouldn't we be looking at potentially other cable companies or broadband companies? For instance, last year we talked with Verizon, and they said that they were already identifying locations for 5G broadband wireless service. Where are we at with that? And do we know what their plans are for that? And how fast are they moving along with that? Now, Mr. Vos, do you happen to know?
Mayor and Council, of course don't in a granular way, but I know in a sort of generic way, and it's not what maybe your community would want to hear, but the way Verizon in particular and the other two big wireless companies are deploying 5G is very similar to the way cable and telephone companies are deployed landline services based on the density of potential customers. Not again, maybe the best news, but that they've been deploying in major urban areas first, suburban next, and et cetera. And I presume that's based because their business model, when they have to deploy more facilities closer to the ground, closer together, becomes more similar to a traditional phone or cable company. There's a lot of capital that needs to be invested on the ground on a per mile basis, and the return is based on density of customers.
Right, and piggyback on that, what Mr. Vos just said. So on our webpage, our website, we have a page called Area Communication Providers, and this was put together by Cassandra back in the day, at least a year ago. And it has a listing of all the cable, internet, and phone providers, and it shows Mediacom, Frontier, Jaguar, which we know has been bought out, satellite services like Viasat, HughesNet, and Dish, fixed wireless, which is mounted antennas and wireless routers like ExtraTime and Nextera, managed internet solutions, which is fixed wireless and mobile routers, and then the cellular companies like Verizon. And if I recall, the Verizon rep, when they were here back in July of 2019, they, it's like state secrets. They're not going to tell you what they're going to do, but I think they described the Highway 7 corridor for commuters, because that's where they see, at least in our city, where they get the most traffic. And as Mr. Vos was talking about, they're looking for density. And, if they're trying to hook up with cell phones, that would be where we'd have the most traffic, would be the Highway 7 corridor. So don't know what their plans are, but that's what I remember from that July of 19 meeting.
So this is Shannon. I have a question. So what other cable companies or cable providers, fiber optic companies are near us? And because it seems like it might be logical if there's a cable company that runs their cable up to Minnetrista, but maybe not through Minnetrista, I'd like to do some exploration, finding out who is around us, and that we're not doing business with, and where are those cables laid? And I think there are maps that are available through the State Office of Broadband that we can get those maps so we can examine them and find out who should we be talking to.
No, cable
I don't know who that
companies
caller is.
So I agree. I think we need to find out what's available, even if they're not directly here. Are they? Is anybody interested in coming here? So my question would be, just to expand cable, is that going to get what our residents need, or do cable companies also expand fiber optics? I don't know. I know the telephone company does, but is that something cable companies do as well? Mr. Vos, do you happen to know?
Yeah, Mayor, in the context of your question, I think I'd go back to my maybe earliest comment, which is because of convergence of these silos, in the sense you're asking, there really aren't cable companies anymore. Mediacom, I guess, traditionally would be viewed as a cable company, but they're really a triple play provider now. And yes, they use fiber and they install fiber and they can expand, their fiber network. I guess, are there companies that are just extending internet extending fiber just to extend internet? I think that really isn't occurring. I think that the business play now is to expand a network to provide triple play services. If you're a new provider, if you're Frontier and you've made your business out of phone, apparently the cable business is difficult to get into, they've discovered, but they're an internet provider too. So I think you'd find that any service provider that's expanding a network in your community is going to be providing 2 or 3 double play or triple play services in the vernacular.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Council, anybody else want to weigh in?
Councilmember Molitor. I think that what it comes down to, and kind of regardless if it's wireless or if it's cable based, it is a matter of density. And obviously, you can invite however many players you'd like, but they're all going to see the same economics around density, and may not be favorably inclined to come in as a result of that. I think in order to really move the needle forward on this, if we're serious about this, we probably have to start helping with the economics of that. And I'm not sure if we have the appetite for that, but I realistically, I think that if we want to have anything done, we'd have to actually step up probably with some dollars to say, hey, we understand that this area is not economically viable for you to serve at this point. And if we're going to, entice them to come, we're going to have to put some kind of a carrot out there. And I'm not sure, how that would happen. And maybe, Mr. Voss, you can provide, if you have any experience in that, if other communities do that, or if what I'm talking about is only theoretical.
Yeah, Mayor and Council, it's a popular question, I think, right now, for a number of reasons. And I guess traditionally the 2 models for doing it would be either partnering in some sense with a private provider, a Mediacom or a Frontier or a Jaguar or another provider, the government partnering in some sense to do that, or local government actually constructing its own network that would be owned by the government. The third approach, which I think has been discussed amongst this council or amongst in your community, would be using public dollars of some source simply to pay or to provide revenue to one of the existing providers to expand into an area, and that raises some legal concerns. And I don't want to go too far down that road because I don't know the answer to the question of what would the authority be and what would the legal pitfalls be. But that approach of simply paying or providing public dollars to existing private competitors, one of them, not all of them, so that one of them would expand into unserved areas, it raises some legal concerns. So the other approaches, again, are viable and have been done, again, partnering or owning your own network. And in either of those approaches, of course, there is some revenue that then comes back, theoretically, some public dollars that would come back to the public participant, to the city in this case.
The only issue that you would have, of course, is if a private company is doing the numbers and looking at their ROI and they're saying it's not viable for them to expand if they don't have at least 15 homes per mile, how viable would it be for the city to undertake its own company, if you will, and expand? To me, it would also be kind of big, huge hole that we might be dumping money into and never see a return on it. So that would be the question that we'd have to ask. Is that something we can spend tax dollars on? But there's also grants available, and I have spoken with our county commissioners, and I've also reached out to some higher authorities at the state level, because I think we also need to start making it clear, specifically here in the western Hennepin County area, that this is an economic development issue right now, and it's going to continue being that. And why can't we tap into some funds, grants, to help our citizens here get better internet? Because many people are working from home, and they really are almost not capable of doing that because of the poor internet and the slow and unreliable internet that they have. And I kind of feel like we out here in the western suburbs have been forgotten, if you so to speak. And you see some other communities getting grants, especially in outstate Minnesota, where there aren't 15 homes per mile, and they're getting grants to put in internet. And here we sit getting nothing. So I think that's another issue that we need to be addressing and looking at.
And Mayor and Council, I apologize. I have to step into my regular meeting now, but I just would echo that is an important consideration as well. You're absolutely right that there are grants, and you're aware of that, I think, clearly. And the points you've made, Mayor, are exactly right. So, but I need to step into this meeting, and so I'm going to sign off. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Bob.
you, Mr. Bose, for coming.
And then
Thank you.
I'll just jump a little bit into that last question and conversation the mayor just had. So grants are always a good thing to get if you can get them. But one of the things that we looked at last year, and I think Councilmember Bruce brought it up to us in an email a little earlier this year, and we're certainly ready here at the city to continue to look into it. But I will say, when Allie looked into it, we tried to make some contact, and I think she did, with somebody who helps administer the grants or oversees it or something. And Allie, you can jump in here in a second, but a lot of the grants end up in the hands of the cities that are unserved versus underserved. And we're considered underserved, not unserved. When you mentioned something like an outstate city, that would be unserved. Whereas here in Minnetrista, in the far western suburbs of Hennepin County, we'd be underserved. So, Allie, if you want to talk a little bit about that. But like I said, we're more than happy to keep pursuing this. But because frankly, that's a whole bucket of money that it would be great for our residents. But Allie, if you want to just chime in about what you found out a little while ago.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Councilmember Bruce emailed Mike and myself, it was around July or early August, asking about, and specifically, the DEED broadband grant. And I think this is what, I know there are a lot of grants, but this is the one Mike is referring to. So I contacted the DEED coordinator and also several cities that were awarded the project. And just a few notes that I got from those conversations. This specific grant requires shovel-ready projects. So because the city is not a broadband provider, it would need to partner with a provider to answer all the questions on the application, have design plans prepared, etc. So that would require us partnering with Mediacom. that's not insurmountable. Of the slightly comparable 2019 winners of this grant, which was only 2, Independence and Rosemount, the city only contributed a letter of support to the provider. So the city was not the applicant. The provider, which I think was Mediacom for both of them, or Charter, the city was not involved in the application process. They just provided a letter of support. In 2019, of the 30 winners, 2 were even remotely close to the metro. Of the 30 winners, only 13 had underserved and unserved locations. So, as Mike said, Minnetrista is just underserved. There are no unserved locations. And DEED did not fund any projects that were entirely underserved areas, which we are. In the 2019 grant round, DEED received 80 applicants, awarded 30 projects, and 2 which were even kind of close to the metro. So I'm not saying this is impossible. I think this grant in particular would be difficult for us to get awarded. We did supply a letter of support to Mediacom about a month ago for,
Correct.
let me bring it up here, for Farm Hill Road, Wind Ridge Trail, Northfield Drive, and Oxy Oak Circle. So we did provide a letter of support to Mediacom for that, but
Correct.
as the sole applicant, I'm not sure if I'm missing anything there, Mike, but that's just from my
Well,
research that I did in the summer.
so when they
Well,
asked
here's
for
what
the
I
letter
would.
of support, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm just going to chime in here real quick. When you say we're underserved, I think a lot of residents, particularly that only have the option of Frontier, would tell you we are not served. In other words,
Well, we don't get to
I
come
know,
up with that
but
description.
no, but any community anywhere in Minnesota is underserved. Any community anywhere in Minnesota would have the option of phone, either dial up or phone connection. So you can't really say that there's some communities that are not served. So I think we fall into that same category as many of the communities that are outstate or that claim that they're not served. Especially now, granted, not all of our area, but some of the area in Minnetrista is basically not served. And so I think we should at least approach it from that angle.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. And I asked that question, what would the city of Minnetrista be considered if we were applying for this grant? And they said we would be considered underserved, not unserved, because we do have I don't make that criteria. That's how they process these applications and do their point system on who gets awarded these grants, is who is considered unserved. We are underserved by their measure. So that's not maybe what I would say is my measure, but by their calculations, that's what we are.
Okay. All right.
I agree with you.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions? Okay. All right. Mr. Trumperlin, you haven't really weighed in at all. Do you have any comments or questions?
No, I haven't heard anything that I didn't expect. The supplier, trying to get more fiber optic buried outside of our large housing developments is an impossibility, in my opinion. They won't invest in it, and we as a city, I don't think that's a road we want to go down with trying to subsidize it. I don't see the return on that, even though we're trying to help our citizens. I think for a start here, and obviously those that are really rural, you can't go to a satellite provider, even though their capabilities aren't the best either. And if you have to deal with Verizon or the other two, as we've heard earlier, they're probably not going to be quick to come out into an urban/rural area. So for me, I'd like to see a better set of these maps because looking at them, I can't get the feel for the streets or the locations that we're looking at. And then we can discuss phase 3, what that meant, and if we're not going down that road yet, then maybe we have an issue with one, not renewing the contract, but renegotiating the contract with Mediacom. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Oh, okay. All right. Anybody else? Okay. So it sounds like a couple of things here tonight. I'll kind of paraphrase. We really all need to see a better maps of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In addition to that, we really need to see what have they done for phase 1 and or phase 2, and what are their plans for phase 3. And the other thing that was asked is who are the providers that maybe, for instance, Jaguar or whatever company it currently is, I've heard that they come right up to the edge of Minnetrista, whether they do or not, but that would be another resource to look into to see where exactly are these other providers, how close do they come to Minnetrista, and maybe at least have some kind of conversation with them. Now, the other question I would have is, we've talked a little bit about Frontier, but is Frontier planning on doing any upgrades in their rural area? I know it's not the best solution, but currently they're horrible. I mean, they're just terrible, and probably it's because so many people are on maybe one node. So I guess my question would be, is Frontier planning on any upgrades to their system? Anybody else have anything that they'd like staff to look into that we haven't discussed or haven't already mentioned?
I think those are 3 good discussion points and direction for staff between the maps, the status of contract and all the phases, and then providers that are near but not here kind of thing. We can certainly explore all those. We can also look at grants and other options for that kind of funding. So I think we have something to work on. The only other thing I'll throw out there is, I think Mr. Vose alluded to it a little bit about when he was talking about the phases, and if they did not do or comply with phase 3, whatever that build out entailed, if they can't identify. One of the things that would be nice is, not knowing this clause in the contract about the extra 5 years, I mean, if we do some review and report back to the council at a point in the future here about where we are with all the phases, and we feel like the Mediacom hasn't lived up to their end of the bargain, we can hopefully press them to say we would like to see the contract end for 10 years and not roll over the additional 5. But one of the things to think about, and we don't have to decide this tonight, is it might behoove the city to find an expert in the area that understands how to. It could be an attorney, could be Mr. Vose, could be anybody else. I don't care. But look at somebody that could have some technical expertise in dealing with telecommunication companies and hire them as a agent of the city to review our contract and to help us negotiate the next contract. Because I was here, it was in the early stages of my career here at Minnetrista. I was not involved at all in the contract negotiation. We pulled out of Lake Minnetonka Cable and went off on our own. But so I think you might want to approach it with somebody who's an expert in the area, a paid professional by the city to look out for our interests. It could, I don't know what the price tag would be, but it might be worth the money to make sure that whatever contract we have in the future with Mediacom, that it would have some teeth in it for goals for building out the city down the road. That might be something to consider. Like I said, you don't have to obviously discuss that tonight.
This is Shannon Bruce, and I agree with that, Mike. I think that would be worth exploring, but I also think it would be worth examining the Frontier contract as well, because I know part of the problem with Frontier is they deliver DSL, as we all know, but they also just have a T1 connection going down to their connector box off of Highway 12. And if there's anything in their contract that the city could pressure them into upgrading that to a fiber line instead of T1, that would help immensely. But I know they're not, they're reluctant to upgrade anything because they all know that 5G, well, they're in financial trouble, but they also know that 5G is on the horizon, and they're not going to invest anything into their infrastructure unless the city has leverage to pressure them to do it. And we need to examine their contract to see if that's the case.
And that could be part
Mr. Brony,
of whatever.
do we have a contract? But Ms. Brony, do we have a contract with Frontier?
You know, I assume we do, Mayor, but I haven't looked at it myself. If I have, it's been a long time. So we'd have to look and review and see. And if we can't get one, we can certainly find out from Frontier where we can get a copy. So I could also talk to Mr. Beatty. He's got some history here and may know about it. So, but off the top of my head, I can't tell you, Mayor. So I just can't.
Okay. Well, we'd have to look into that.
Yeah, what Ms. Bruce said and what you're saying, I think are both valid points. I mean, there's a couple providers here. We should, you know, if we can work on both, we certainly can. And again, that paid consultant could be somebody that helps us look at both potentially. So,
okay.
I don't have expertise. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I understand it somewhat, but I'm not an expert. So,
right. All right. Anybody else? Otherwise, we can be adjourned for now, and we'll bring this back. Mr. Brony, any idea in terms of time frame? It's always good to kind of have a time frame on this, knowing when it may come back for further discussion.
You know, I can't tell you tonight, Mayor. I think I'll try to have a conversation with city staff, and we'll kind of examine the information we have, whether it's a Frontier contract, this contract or whatever, and we'll try to work on it and get back to the council. I just can't give you a time frame tonight.
Okay, so maybe at our next council meeting, you can give us a time frame. Then you can look at it now, and then at our next meeting, let us know what you think would be appropriate or enough time to put these ideas together and information together for another meeting.
That sounds good.
All right. All right. With that, we can be adjourned if there's no other comments or questions. All right. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved. This is Pam.
Okay. I think Ms. Bruce made that motion and Ms. Mortensen seconded. All those in favor signify with aye. I vote aye. Lisa Whalen. Ms. Bruce?
Aye.
Ms. Mortensen?
Aye.
Mr. Molitor?
Aye.
Mr. Chamberlain?
Aye.
Okay, we are adjourned, and we will reconvene at 7 o'clock for our regular council meeting. Thank you.